August 25th, 1940. A formation of Heinkel H-111 bombers drones through the night sky somewhere over the English Channel. Their crews hunched over maps and instruments, certain, absolutely certain of their target. Below them, London sleeps. Or rather, London is supposed to sleep. The German High Command has issued strict orders. No bombs are to fall on the British capital. Hitler himself has made this clear. The civilians below are not the objective. The airfields are. The radar stations are. The RAF is. What happens next will not be remembered in any German operations log as a success. A navigational error, compounded by poor visibility and the peculiar chaos of night flying, sends those bombs tumbling not onto the docks or the factories the crews were hunting, but onto the East End of London itself. Houses crumble. Fires bloom in the darkness. Civilians die in their beds. It is an accident, an embarrassing, catastrophic, utterly avoidable accident, and it will change the course of the war. Not because of the damage it causes, which is, by the standards of what is to come, relatively modest, but because of what it forces Winston Churchill to do next. In a decision that will haunt German High Command for the remainder of the Battle of Britain, Britain will respond. And in responding, it will hand the RAF something no amount of clever engineering or courageous flying could have provided on its own: time. To understand why that single misdropped stick of bombs mattered so profoundly, you first need to understand precisely how close the RAF had come to losing everything. By late August 1940, Fighter Command was hemorrhaging. Not aircraft, though those losses were severe, but pilots. Experienced men. The ones who could keep a Spitfire alive in a turning fight, who knew instinctively when to brake and when to press, were being ground down at a rate that no training school could hope to match. In the first 2 weeks of August alone, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 230 British aircraft. Another 154 were damaged beyond immediate repair. But the deeper wound was to the infrastructure that kept those aircraft flying. Luftwaffe commanders, following the strategic guidance of General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had identified Fighter Command's sector stations, the nerve centers that controlled scrambles, directed aircraft, and coordinated the entire defensive network, as the decisive target. Biggin Hill had been bombed 6 times in a fortnight. Manston was rendered temporarily unusable. Kenley, Hornchurch, Debden, all battered. The sector operations rooms, buried underground and staffed by WAAF plotters moving little wooden markers across vast maps or running on improvisation and nerve. At Bentley Priory, where Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding presided over Fighter Command with the methodical calm of a man who had been expecting exactly this crisis for years, the numbers told a story that could not be argued with. Pilot attrition was exceeding replacements by a significant margin. Some estimates from the period suggest Fighter Command was losing roughly 100 pilots a week at the campaign's peak, whilst training could produce perhaps half that number at the same standard. Experienced flight commanders were being replaced by men who had accumulated just a handful of operational hours. The margin was narrowing, and everyone at Bentley Priory knew it. Churchill's response to the bombing of London was almost instantaneous, and it was not driven purely with emotion, though emotion was certainly present. Within 24 hours, the Prime Minister authorized the Bomber Command to retaliate directly against Berlin. The raid, carried out on the night of 25th through 26 August 1940 by 81 Hampden and Wellington bombers drawn from squadrons based in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, was not expected to cause catastrophic damage. The crews knew this. The air staff knew this. Berlin was at the very edge of effective range. The bombers would be operating without fighter escort over the full distance, and the night navigation techniques of 1940 were, to put it charitably, still developing. What arrived over the capital was a modest force by any objective standard, delivering relatively limited tonnage onto a sprawling industrial and residential target. Cloud cover obscured much of the city. Some bombs landed on farmlands south of the city. The material damage was, measured against what the Luftwaffe was doing to British airfields, embarrassingly slight. But the psychological and strategic effect was seismic. Hermann Göring had personally promised the German people, had promised Hitler, had promised the Luftwaffe itself that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Reich capital. He had been spectacularly, publicly wrong. 3 more RAF raids followed in quick succession. Göring's credibility was damaged, and Hitler, whose tolerance for humiliation was notoriously low, arrived at a decision that his own operational commanders would quietly recognize as a strategic gift to the enemy. He ordered the Luftwaffe to abandon its campaign against the RAF's airfields and sector stations, and to begin the systematic bombing of London instead. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The comparison with what the Luftwaffe was doing and what it now abandoned is worth dwelling on. Göring's campaign against fighter command's infrastructure was working. The Junkers 88s and Heinkel H111s hitting Biggin Hill and Kenley were striking at the connective tissue of the entire defensive system. Had it continued for another fortnight at the same tempo, serious analysts believe that several sector stations could have been rendered permanently unoperational, forcing Dowding to abandon the southeast of England entirely and pull his surviving force northward, beyond effective range of the crucial Channel convoy routes and the invasion beaches. The Americans, then still neutral but watching with professional interest, had their own bomber forces and their own theories about strategic air power. The United States Army Air Forces were committed to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, heavily armored aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress, operating in tight defensive formations. They observed the Luftwaffe's shift to night area bombing of London with some puzzlement. The German approach, attacking civilian morale and industrial capacity through indiscriminate night raids, was strategically and doctrinally different from what both the RAF and the USAAF would eventually pursue. What Hitler's directive achieved in practical terms was to remove the pressure from Dowding's most critical vulnerabilities, right at the moment when that pressure was becoming unsustainable. The sector stations were given days, and then weeks, to repair, rebuild, and restaff. Pilot training was accelerated. Replacement aircraft arrived at dispersal points with mechanics actually present to service them. The breathing room was not enormous, and it was not entirely comfortable, but it was real, and it was bought not by British brilliance, but by German error compounding German error across a chain of decisions that began with one confused Heinkel over London on the night of 25th August. Their crew didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know they were making history. They were frightened men in a noisy, vibrating metal tube, flying by dead reckoning through darkness over a blacked-out city, trying to identify landmarks that weren't there, trying to hit a target they could not see. When the bombs fell, they probably believed, for a few hopeful hours at least, that they had done their job. What they had actually done was set in motion a sequence of decisions: British retaliation, German fury, Hitler's directive, Göring's pivot, that would give the RAF the one thing it was running out of: time to survive. Not victory, not dominance, merely survival, extended by days and then weeks, until autumn weather and Hitler's attention began to drift eastward, towards Russia and the grand ambitions that would eventually consume the Reich entirely. The Battle of Britain was not won by a single heroic act or a single brilliant innovation. It was won by 1,000 acts of ordinary competence, by women plotting aircraft movements in underground rooms, by mechanics working through the night by torchlight, by controllers vectoring exhausted pilots onto fresh formations of enemy bombers, by Dowding's stubborn refusal to exhaust his reserves in grand gestures, and it was won, in no small measure, by one German crew who got lost. The dumbest bombing mission in the history of the Luftwaffe turned out to be the one that saved Britain. Some victories arrive wearing the face of disaster, and some disasters, examined closely enough, look almost like a plan.